Hey, folks, welcome in to another episode of A Nichols Worth. I'm your host, Keaton Nichols. Check me out everywhere on social media at Keaton D. Nichols, just like the good folks on Instagram are doing right now at Keaton D. Nichols, at Keaton D. Nichols. Make sure you follow the show. You'll see it at the bottom of the screen there at A Nichols Worth. You can now subscribe, which is kind of a cool feature on Spotify, on Anchor, and on YouTube. Definitely if you like the visual. You can always do that kind of thing as well. So happy Friday out there to everybody. Make sure you go check out our sponsor tonight, Parkour Therapy, over at parkourtherapy.com and sign up for your free week of digital workouts with Parkour Plus. Get that summer bod right. It's the perfect time to do so. So shout out to our sponsors, Parkour Therapy. So today, I did want to talk a little bit about COVID. We didn't get there on Wednesday because I didn't want to pack in too many things, but we got a couple of key pieces of information this week regarding COVID that I thought was worth mentioning, and they're kind of intertwined and related as well. So let's get to those sort of things right now. Before we get going, too, if you want to comment in on the show, if you have something that you want to add to the conversation, I know this isn't directly like Clubhouse or anything else like that, but feel free to jump in. I'll make sure and read your comment before the end of the show. And hopefully it'll spark some discussion. That's what I love on this show. I love discussing things. Let's get deep. Let's critically think. Let's get to it. All right, let's start out. CDC Director Rochelle Walensky, she's going to be the star of the show. Spoiler alert. She said this week that the B117 variant of the coronavirus, some people refer to it as the UK variant of the coronavirus, is now the dominant strain of the coronavirus here in the United States. It's actually one of the more dominant strains in the world right now. There are other variants, but this is the one, right? Like, this is the variant that you want to watch out for. Now, since January, when there were only 76 cases of the new variant, the B117 variant here in the United States, the CDC has been warning us, as Americans, I should say, that the newer, more contagious variant is well on its way to spreading throughout the rest of the country. It wasn't the first time, wasn't even the first time within the pandemic that we had leading, experts, for lack of a better term, virologists and medical experts that were saying, hey, something bigger is coming, right? And the sort of interesting thing about people in the science and medical field is that they're not really all that political. Their position and what they do naturally kind of is an apolitical sort of thing. And so there, in my estimation, there was really no reason to believe that CDC officials or health health and ministry officials across the world would have any reason to sort of game the system, right? To tell these CDC directors to go out into the general public and tell them things to scare them into fearing the pandemic more. We'll get into this a little bit later, but they're completely apolitical. What they were telling us was that something serious is coming, and predictably, rather unsurprisingly, if you will, we didn't react to it. Many states right after that in January moved to reopen. I'm looking at you, Texas. They moved to reopen, or they at least promised to reopen within the next couple of weeks. Nobody that looked at this thing and nobody that studied this thing was saying that that was a good idea. Played to our emotions. A lot of us wanted to get back to normalcy, so we said, screw it. Let's do it. Now, deaths since January have declined about 20%. And that's good news, right? That is due in large part to a significant portion of older Americans who were just being slaughtered by this thing, right? Older Americans and those with underlying health conditions they didn't have a chance. So now that we've vaccinated approximately a third of the country, many of those people, deaths from COVID have declined about 20% since January. But the bigger issue here seems to be that the new variant is infecting a much younger population. So the recent outbreaks that we've been seeing over the last couple of weeks and the last couple of months have come from, things like youth sports, young people, schools, young people gathering in some way, shape, or form. Because people, if you're not 16 years of age or older, you're not even eligible for the vaccine at all, right? And so part of this new variant is that it's affecting people who are younger. The average age of people who are getting severely sick from coronavirus has fallen. It's dropped into, the people in their late 30s and in their early 40s are now beginning to get gravely ill at rates that we hadn't seen. And perhaps those vaccination numbers sort of put a false narrative in many people's heads, especially a people that is, a country, rather, a whole population, a world population that is eager to get back out there. But I think the number of vaccinations is giving us sort of a false negative about how safe it is, or it's convincing us that maybe things are not completely safe, but they're safer. And you've got to be careful with that, because we want to get back to normal. We want to push towards this. But this variant changes the game dramatically. And any variant that might come as a result of this after this is also going to change the game dramatically. Science and health experts don't know everything about it, but they do know that it spreads more quickly, and it's obviously infecting a much younger population. So the virus issue itself is bad, but again, I'm more concerned about our behavior as a human race. That will be what ultimately determines what happens with this thing. And it's difficult because, all of us grew up in a world that was, tremendously unprepared for this moment. Like, we had virologists and we had experts and things that said this kind of thing could happen. We knew that to an extent, right? But I think the bigger issue here, the bigger piece of this is that we weren't prepared for this moment coming in. And now that it's here, we haven't shown that we've been able to kind of rise to that moment, where something unprecedented comes across the table and we as human beings or as Americans or whatever say we are better than this. We've risen above this. We haven't done that yet. And I fear that failure to rise to the moment is going to result in much more disaster before it brings us any sort of hope. And hopefully normalcy. But it's going to take all of us to sort of turn the tide, if you will. A lot of people think it's already over, that we're just slowly careening towards normalcy, but we're not. And it's going to take all of us to do so. This is not about politics. There's nothing political about this. And so when we go to the table rather of solutions, that needs to be the first thing wiped off the table. Is how does this affect people on the left? How does this affect people on the right? Who is this to the advantage of, people on the left or right? Nobody's winning. Nobody's winning because of this. And any sort of political conversations that get thrown into solutions about what to do about the COVID vaccine or COVID virus, quickly becomes non-productive, and I think we start to move backwards in our evolutionary scale. So let's kind of keep that in mind. The common sense and research are going to be the things that save us all, right? And the research portion of it will be taken care of by the scientific professionals and things like that. But it's up to us, the regular people, everyone else, to apply the common sense. So please, I beg, if we hope to have maybe next summer as a normal summer, if we maybe hope to return to some form of normalcy within a year, let's get it together. And that's everybody. All right, so our second story kind of has, or the main story, I guess you could say, our main story tonight, has a lot to do with that first one as well. I heard this information yesterday, and I was like, oh, this is quite interesting, because if you guys know me, I am definitely not a fan of what I like to call diversity initiatives. Diversity initiatives are shiny and they're good for your rep. They're good for the scene and everything else like that. But diversity initiatives, oftentimes, I consider them to be a failure because they don't dig at the base of the problem, right? That's how I feel about diversity initiatives. Now, the news today is not necessarily a diversity initiative, but it's something along those lines. And so I'll explain first what it is and the issue that I have with things like this popping up at a time like this as well. Make sure you leave your comments in the comment section if you want to get in on the conversation. Now, yesterday, CDC Director Rochelle Walensky, there she goes again. I told you she's going to be the star tonight. She addressed a racism in health initiative that is to be executed by the Centers for Disease Control. Now, this is according to both Politico and Time Magazine. I'll be pulling quotes from both of those articles. But according to the CDC, the ratio of Black and Latino Americans, or Latinx Americans, I should say, who are hospitalized are because of COVID-19 are around 2 to 3 times that of whites, and death ratios are around 2 times higher. Now, kind of one of those, like, tell me something I didn't know. Strangely, since the beginning of the pandemic, we had already seen sort of a separation, if you will, in how deadly and how devastating this was to particular communities, and that disparity, there's the right word, disparity seemed to be drawn along racial lines. And so oftentimes do we say that in this country. X, Y, or Z seems to be drawn along racial lines. Walensky said that the agency was using COVID funding in this as a part of this rescue package to invest in communities of color as well as disproportionately affected groups to address the disparities. This is good, right? All this stuff sounds good. The CDC is coming to the realization that Black and Latino Americans are being disproportionately affected by this virus, and they are now going to dedicate money. How much money? $2.25 billion. That's a huge number. I love the huge numbers because it gets the people go. $2.25 billion at its disposal to address COVID-19 related health disparities and in understanding why certain communities were disproportionately affected by this pandemic. That's a lot. Walensky goes on and says, Walensky says the country will be in a better position to understand and hopefully change that trend before the next outbreak. First of all, I don't want to hear about the next outbreak. We haven't handled this one very well. We're still in the throes of it. Kind of sucks to think it could be another thing like this down the road. Hopefully not in my lifetime. But anyway, the meat of that paragraph, $2.25 billion to understand why there are these discrepancies in so many words. Now, on the surface, that sounds really good. Awesome. The federal government is getting directly involved in helping to close disparity gaps that we have in this country. That should be a good thing, right? That is a good thing. But hold it. Not everything is always as it seems, or nothing new under the sun. You can throw any of those phrases onto what's happening here, because $2.25 billion is nice. And I'm sure it'll go to nice programs. But the very same article, this is in Time Magazine rather. The very same article that laid out the new provisions of this plan for the CDC to approach and attack this issue of racism. Within the same article, people, if you scroll down, it says in the late 1980s, the agency, talking about the CDC, in the late 1980s, the CDC was the first in Department of Health and Human Services history to create its own Office of Minority Health and Health Equity. Now, this is in the 80s. Right? The first department to create the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity. And if you could probably guess, right, they addressed these types of issues. It's the very same article. It's the very same issue that Dr. Walensky is saying we need to figure out what the heck is going on here with racism in our health system, and then we need to eradicate it. Well, it doesn't bode well for the confidence of that plan if you're saying, look, in the 1980s, a federal government organization was formed, a group rather, was formed around this specific issue in the 80s. So my question is, what exactly have you been studying for the last 40 years that we haven't gotten to a point of solutions by this point about disparities and discrepancies in the health system? That's the problem I have with this, right? Even this very article here, and I don't have a problem with Time Magazine. I'm very pro-media and all that other stuff. You won't get that out of me. But Time Magazine, even this article, the way that it's written, the author of this article paints this picture very nicely. very nicely, reassuring us that the fact that the government had created a commission in the 1980s was somehow supposed to be good news for this newer commission. I take it as bad news. It's like hiring a mechanic yesterday to fix your car and then having to hire another mechanic today to fix that same car. What would you say of the first mechanic? It's obvious. You would say that mechanic didn't do the job. It wasn't correct. The problem still exists. You shouldn't pay that mechanic because he didn't do his job or her job. And I look at this kind of like that. We would like to praise the mechanic for working on our car yesterday. And we'd also like to praise the fact that we've hired a new mechanic today to work on our car. It just doesn't make any sense because the car is still broken. Now, bringing this back to this particular analogy, what does all this mean for this? It's not the first time or the second time or the fifth time or the 10th time or the 100th time that some commission or some, government agency has been put together to figure out why exactly it is that, in short, that racism exists in this country. We've put together on this. I talked about this in season 2. Things like the Kerner Commission report in 1967 following race riots in Detroit and some other cities as well. Lyndon Johnson put together this commission, to figure out what the heck is going on. And you know what they found is the interesting thing about that. You can read this about the Kerner Commission if you're extremely bored like I clearly was this week. You can read the details of the Kerner Commission and it's amazing because at the end, when it gets to the findings of the Kerner Commission, this is in 1967, people. The findings of this Kerner Commission report said something not too different from white people white people definitely did create this system of oppression that black people now have to wade through as a way of finding equality in this country. Boom! Nailed it. Let's put it all up in our briefcase and go home. We don't need any more research after that. A federal commission in the midst of the civil rights era, made up, by the way, of all white dudes, was able to look at what was going on in certain cities and figure out that black people did not create these problems on their own. Black people do not live in this environment where they enjoy creating more problems and more hurdles for themselves to become equal. Black people didn't do this. It was white folks. Plain and simple. This was more than 40 years ago. And that's not an attack on white people. That's just what happened. It's the history of this country. Got to get used to it. Sorry, it's not my problem. Wasn't me. And so the fact that we keep coming up with these fact-finding projects time and time again that have long since identified the causes and the effects of systemic racism here in this country. We know why. It's long been known that racism has had and continues to have a profound effect on Americans of color. Let's stop with this nonsense of we as Americans haven't fixed and solved the problems of inequality because we simply don't know enough about it. And that's a common thing that is taken on by people everywhere, not just kids, but adults, white folks everywhere, right? That want to argue in some way, shape, or form that the problem is we are so divided. If we were just more together, how many times have you heard, especially a white person, say something like that to you as a person of color? We need to come together as a country. We need to talk across the aisle. We need to understand each other more. That's what these, sort of government commissions and groups that are paid a lot of money, honestly, to research this stuff. That's what's at the core of it. Is, if only we could understand how to treat black people, we would treat them a lot better. Swear, promise, cross my heart, hope to die. If I only knew how to respect a person of color, I totally would. That's a false narrative. And unfortunately, it's a false narrative that's pushed by a lot of the people on the political side, if you will, that claims to help those minorities out the most. And here's what I mean by that, right? The real question, or the real ear that we want to bring up when it comes to these commissions is, what exactly are you going to do about this, right? Like, It's one thing to find out that your house is on fire, but it's another thing to take action to go get some water or call the fire or get some sort of assistance to help, right? Identifying that your house is on fire is an important step in putting out the fire, yes. But just identifying what the problem is not going to do anything about it. And I think that as a country, oftentimes those on the left side of the aisle love to ask questions like this. What can we do to make this country more equitable? How can we find a more equitable solution to things like jobs and farming and promotions and, getting people on TV? How can we find these more equitable solutions? We need to dedicate more resources towards finding more equitable solutions. That's the mindset typically held by the party that oftentimes soaks up a lot of the black vote. I'm talking about the Democrats now, right? It's not enough to ask the question. $2.25 billion, by the way, is a lot of money, and they get it all basically as a part of this package. They don't have to raise it or any fundraise. They have this money to use over the next couple of years, $2.25 billion. But it's not going to fix systemic racism. Sorry, I hate to spoiler alert you again here, but this is not going to work, right? Why? Because inequalities have set a standard as to how we do business in this country. That's important to note, right? Inequalities have set the inequalities that have been allowed to flourish in this country. That has been the thing that has set the standard more so than anything else of how we do business here in this country. Period. Everything is built off of that inequity. I'm not being hyperbolic here. I'm being literal. This is history, right? These are things that we know. We don't have to form a commission to understand that. And until that standard is destroyed, things like this, the CDC's effort to discover what systemic racism is doing to people of color is totally useless. Frivolously futile, completely pointless. But the political effect of it, this is important, the political effect will be that the Democrats can now claim that they are the party that tried to get this right. They made an attempt. We're the party that tries. We're the party that attempted at least to get rid of this. And little things like that begin to be campaign nuggets for the next big election cycle. Hey, I know we didn't do anything about systemic racism, but you remember that one time when the Democratic administration, under a Democratic administration, the CDC launched a whole report to find out what was wrong with systemic racism in our health systems here in the country? Do you remember when that happened? Yeah, that was us. Not to brag about it, but that was us. So, if you don't mind, black people, go ahead and slide that vote in there for the Democrats next time you get a chance, because what else are you going to do? You're going to go to the other side? You're going to vote for the party that, didn't form a commission to try and fix systemic racism in our health system? I love the effort, and it's certainly better than sitting, doing nothing. It's better than ignoring these issues. I like the energy behind it, but unfortunately, I have seen this happen. I have studied enough history to have seen this happen time and again and time and again. I've seen it happen enough times, or read about it, because I wasn't alive in the 80s or 1967, just for a fun fact, but I've read about enough of these issues in the past and the effects or lack of effect after that to know that this is something that is exactly the same as what we've seen before. And that's not something that I am going to let motivate me or to gaslight me when it comes to, me turning in my next vote. Just not going to do it. These are the things that we constantly have to think about. And again, we have to think about them now. 2022, I guess, would be the next midterm election year. If you are just starting to think about what have the Democrats or what have the Republicans done for me lately, and it's the year 2022, and you're trying to make a decision on midterm elections, you are too late. These are the lines in which the battle was drawn. Not everything is as it seems, and I think that we got to be extremely woke, if you will. even though I hate that term. We got to be extremely woke to these sort of issues, because the biggest tragedy that I think can come out of something like this is people who depend on the results of this commission, right? And I'm talking about people of color. People who depend on the results of this administration should not be gassed up to believe that help is on the way if help is not on the way. If you ain't going to help, just say that. That's cool. We can spend our time gaining political favor for what we need from someone else. No, it might not be any of the political parties. It'll just be someone else. But we need to have those things clear and free in our minds, that while, being stabbed by the smooth knife is certainly a lot better than being stabbed by the serrated knife, what we as black people have to say to ourselves is, I'm just not down with getting stabbed anymore. I've been choosing between this serrated knife and smooth knife for way too many years. I just don't want to be stabbed anymore. And what we got to do before that point of getting stabbed is we got to start identifying what that knife looks like. To keep with that analogy, we got to understand what the knife looks like, because too many of us are getting stabbed and then realizing, oh, this is a problem. So keep that in mind. That's all I got for today. Make sure you leave your comments in the comment section if you're listening to this on the replay, and give us a share on the timelines. I appreciate everyone who joined in live, and of course everyone who watched the show on the replay. I appreciate you all as well. I will be back on Monday. I know I keep saying I'm going to be back on, this day, and then I don't show up. Stuff comes up. But I'm looking at it. April the 12th, I should be here on Monday as well. I hope everyone has a great weekend. Make sure you stay safe out there as well. And I'll catch everybody on the flippity flip.